The 13th century, Europe at a crossroads. A man ascends to the papal throne whose figure still provokes heated debate among historians. Innocent III, a brilliant intellectual or a cold-blooded manipulator, a reformer of the church or a power-hungry politician. His 18-year reign marked a time of unprecedented papal power. Never before and never after did Rome's spiritual authority reach such heights of influence on European politics. Some see him as a defender of Christian values and a renovator of the church. Others as a power-hungry politician who stooped to any means to achieve his goals. Was he indeed the Dark Cardinal, as his opponents called him, or a sincere reformer striving to cleanse the church of vices? Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. To understand the contradictory nature of this man, we must delve into the complex world of medieval politics, intrigues, and religious conflicts. Lothar of Segni, the future Pope Innocent III, was born in 1160 or 1161 in the castle of Segni, near Rome. His birth into the family of the Counts of Segni predetermined much of his destiny. The Segni family belonged to the ancient Roman aristocracy and was related by blood to other influential Italian families. Particularly important was his kinship with the powerful Conti clan, which subsequently played a decisive role in his ecclesiastical career. From an early age, young Lothar demonstrated exceptional intellectual abilities and a strong character. His parents spared no expense in their heir's education, sending him first to the monastic school of St. Andrew in Rome, where he acquired basic knowledge and imbibed the spirit of ecclesiastical discipline. The brilliant abilities of the young man demanded a more serious education. The next stage of his intellectual development was his studies at the University of Paris, a recognized center of theological thought in medieval Europe. Here, Lothar studied theology under the guidance of prominent thinkers of his time, including Peter Cantor. His thirst for knowledge then led him to Bologna, the cradle of legal science, where he mastered canon law. This combination of theological and legal education formed the unique mindset of the future pontiff, simultaneously a theoretician of ecclesiastical power and a practitioner of church governance. Returning to Rome around 1180, Lothar began a rapid ascent through the ranks of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. His career was aided by his uncle, Cardinal Paolo Scolari, who later became Pope Clement III. At the age of 29, Lothar had already received the cardinal's hat, an unusually young age for such a high office. His appointment as Cardinal Deacon of the Church of Santi Sergio e Bacco opened the doors to the highest echelons of church power for him. During the pontificate of Pope Celestine III, who disliked the Conti family, Lothar temporarily found himself in the shadows. These years he devoted to intellectual work, writing several theological treatises, including the famous work On the Contempt of the World. This work revealed the duality of his nature. On the one hand, deep piety and ascetic inclinations. On the other, a clear understanding of the mechanisms of power and human weaknesses. The death of Celestine III in January 1198 opened the way to the papal throne. The conclave of cardinals unanimously elected the 37-year-old Lothar as the new pontiff. His youth, brilliant education, aristocratic origin, and kinship with influential Italian families, all this made him an ideal candidate in the eyes of the ecclesiastical elite. Thus began one of the most significant pontificates in the history of the Catholic Church. On January 8, 1198, the conclave of cardinals gathered in the Roman Church of Septa Solis. Celestine III had passed away the day before, and the Holy See required a new pastor. The choice fell upon Cardinal Lotario di Segni, a man of only 37 years of age. Such youth for a pope was almost unprecedented in the history of the Church. Adopting the name Innocent III, he immediately demonstrated a determination to change the established order of things. Already on the day of his election, the new pontiff refused the traditional procession to the Lateran Palace. Instead, he insisted on preliminary ordination as a priest, and then as a bishop, as until that moment he had remained only a cardinal deacon. This act symbolized his deep respect for church traditions and, simultaneously, his intention to strengthen the authority of the papacy. In his first sermon, Innocent declared, "The Vicar of Christ stands between God and man, below God but above man, less than God but greater than man." These words became the programmatic statement of his entire pontificate. The young pope quickly set about reforming the papal curia. He expelled corrupt officials, streamlined finances, and reduced the expenses of the papal court. Innocent paid particular attention to strengthening the papal states in central Italy. Within a few months, he re-established control over territories lost by his predecessors. A key element of the new pontiff's political doctrine was the theory of the supremacy of spiritual power over temporal power. Innocent developed the concept of the two swords, the spiritual and the temporal. In his view, both swords belonged to the Church, but the temporal one was entrusted by it to monarchs for use under the guidance of spiritual authority. This theory was reflected in his famous letter, where he wrote, "As the moon receives its light from the sun, so royal power borrows its grandeur and splendor from papal authority." The young pope's ambitions extended far beyond Italy. Already in the first months of his reign, he sent legates to all European courts with letters asserting the supremacy of papal power. Particularly indicative were his relations with Germany, where, after the death of Emperor Henry VI, a struggle erupted between Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick. Innocent, acting as an arbiter, unequivocally made it clear that the right to approve the emperor belonged to the pope. Contemporaries were astonished by the energy and industriousness of the new pontiff. He personally reviewed hundreds of cases, dictated dozens of letters daily, and found time for theological reflection. His intellect, political acumen, and organizational talent laid the foundation for an unprecedented strengthening of papal power in the subsequent years. The political theology of Innocent III became the cornerstone of papal power for centuries to come. At the heart of his doctrine lay the famous theory of the two swords, stemming from words in the Gospel of Luke. According to this concept, there are two swords of power, spiritual and temporal. Both belong to the Church, but the temporal sword is entrusted by it to monarchs, who must wield it under the guidance of spiritual authority. In his bull, Venerabilem, Innocent wrote, "The temporal power is subject to the spiritual, as the body is subject to the soul." With these words, he asserted the supremacy of the papacy over all earthly rulers. The image of the sun and moon became a key metaphor in Innocent's political theology. Just as the moon receives its light from the sun, so, in his view, temporal power derives its legitimacy from spiritual authority. In a letter to the French king Philip Augustus, he unequivocally stated, 3. Innocent drew theological justification for his political claims from the concept of the Pope as the Vicar of Christ on earth. Unlike his predecessors who called themselves, 4, he was the first to systematically use the title, 5, the direct Vicar of Christ. This radically altered the status of the pontiff. He now acted not merely as the successor of an apostle, but as a direct representative of God in the earthly world. Innocent backed his theoretical constructs with practical actions. When a dispute over succession flared up in Germany, he openly declared his right to decide who was worthy of the imperial crown. In the decretal, quote, 6, he asserted that the Pope had the right to intervene in the affairs of any Christian state if it concerned sin or the salvation of the soul. This doctrine, known as, quote, 7, provided theoretical justification for papal intervention in any secular matters. The intellectual baggage Innocent acquired in Paris and Bologna allowed him to couch his political ambitions in the form of a coherent legal theory. He skillfully used texts of Roman law, reinterpreting them in favor of papal power. His chancellery produced decretals, papal letters with decisions on specific issues, which then became precedents and were incorporated into collections of canon law. The influence of Innocent's ideas on medieval political thought can hardly be overestimated. His doctrine of papal theocracy became the ideological foundation for the unprecedented expansion of papal power in the 13th century. Even after Innocent's death, his political theology continued to define the relationship between church and state. His followers Gregory IX and Innocent IV developed and deepened his ideas, bringing the concept of papal supremacy to its logical conclusion. The papal state had always been a unique political entity on the map of medieval Europe. But it was under Innocent III that it truly transformed into a territorial power. When the young pontiff ascended the throne, he found that the real power of the Holy See extended only to a small part of the lands nominally subordinate to it. Most territories were controlled by local nobility, urban communes, or German viceroys. Innocent immediately set about rectifying the situation. Within the first 2 years of his reign, he managed to restore papal control over the March of Ancona, the Duchy of Spoleto, and most of Romagna. His main adversary in the struggle for these lands was Marquard von Anweiler, the imperial seneschal appointed by the late Emperor Henry VI. Innocent not only used military force, but also skillfully played on the contradictions between various political factions. The Pope's relations with the Roman Commune proved particularly complex. The citizens of the Eternal City, inspired by republican traditions, sought self-governance and independence from papal authority. Innocent, however, was not prepared to tolerate such a state of affairs. When, in 1203, the Roman senator Pandulf di Subura attempted to expand the powers of city self-governance, the Pope intervened decisively. He secured the adoption of a new city constitution, according to which the senator was required to swear an oath of allegiance to the pontiff. Thus, Innocent effectively transformed an elected office into a papal appointment. The true triumph of Innocent's territorial policy was the annexation of the Matildine lands, extensive possessions in Tuscany and Emilia, which had been a subject of dispute between the papacy and the empire for a century. In 1209, Otto IV, who owed his imperial crown to Innocent, formally recognized the Pope's rights to these territories. However, the emperor's gratitude proved short-lived. Soon after his coronation, Otto broke his promise and invaded southern Italy, threatening papal possessions. Innocent responded by excommunicating the emperor and supporting a new claimant to the imperial throne, the young Frederick Hohenstaufen. This political maneuver clearly demonstrated how skillfully the pontiff used spiritual power to protect his territorial interests. By the end of Innocent's reign, the papal state had become the most extensive and stable political entity in central Italy. From the Roman Campagna to the Adriatic coast, from Tuscany to the borders of the Kingdom of Naples, everywhere, the Pope's authority was recognized not only as a spiritual leader, but also as a territorial sovereign. European politics at the beginning of the 13th century resembled a complex game of chess, where Innocent III acted as a grand master, skillfully moving pieces across the board. No pope before him had intervened so actively in the internal affairs of European monarchies, using ecclesiastical instruments of power as a political weapon. The most striking example was his conflict with the English king John Lackland. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1205, a dispute arose over the appointment of a successor. John nominated his own candidate, but Innocent insisted on Stephen Langton. The king refused to recognize this appointment, and the Pope placed all of England under interdict, a prohibition on religious services and church sacraments. For 6 years, church bells in England did not ring, and no weddings or public services were held. When even this did not break the king's will, Innocent excommunicated John and declared him deposed, transferring the English crown to the French king Philip Augustus. Faced with the threat of a French invasion, John was forced to capitulate. In 1213, he not only recognized Langton as archbishop, but also declared England a papal fief, pledging to pay annual tribute to the Holy See. This triumph of papal diplomacy clearly demonstrated how skillfully Innocent used spiritual authority to achieve political goals. No less indicative was his role in the dynastic struggle in Germany. After the death of Emperor Henry VI, a conflict erupted between Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick. Innocent supported Otto, demanding in return recognition of papal authority over Italy. When Otto, having received the imperial crown, broke his promises and invaded southern Italy, the Pope unhesitatingly excommunicated him and supported the young Frederick Hohenstaufen. This political flexibility elicited admiration from some and condemnation from others. Many contemporaries accused Innocent of unscrupulousness and lust for power. However, for the pontiff himself, such actions were merely a tool for asserting a higher principle, the supremacy of spiritual over secular authority. The Fourth Crusade became one of the most controversial episodes of Innocent III's pontificate. Conceived as a sacred mission to liberate Jerusalem, it devolved into a tragedy that fractured the Christian world. In the autumn of 1201, the Pope announced a new crusade against the Muslims. In his bull, he wrote, "The Holy Land awaits deliverance, and it is every Christian's duty to take up the cross and come to its defense." Innocent intended to direct the combined forces of European knights to Egypt, a key center of Muslim power in the Middle East. However, reality quickly diverged from his plans. The Crusaders, gathered in Venice, were unable to pay for the agreed-upon sea transport. The cunning Doge Enrico Dandolo offered a deferment of payment in exchange for help in capturing the Christian city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. When news of the attack on the Christian city reached Rome, Innocent was furious. He sent a wrathful message to the Crusaders. "Let none of you delude yourselves into believing that you are entitled to seize or plunder the lands of Christians under the pretext of their disobedience to the Apostolic See." The Pope even excommunicated the Venetians, but his anger did not stop the further distortion of the sacred mission. The tragedy reached its climax when the army turned towards Constantinople. On April 13, 1204, the Crusaders stormed the Byzantine capital. The ensuing 3 days of plunder and violence shocked even seasoned contemporaries. Priceless relics and treasures of a 1,000-year-old Christian culture were pillaged. Niketas Choniates, a Byzantine historian, wrote, "Even the Saracens are merciful and kind compared to these men who bear the cross of Christ." News of the fall of Constantinople evoked mixed feelings in Innocent. On the one hand, he condemned the cruelty of the Crusaders, those who should have fought the infidels bathed in Christian blood. On the other hand, he quickly realized the political advantages of establishing Latin control over the Eastern Church. In a letter to the new Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, he already spoke of the wondrous deed of the Lord, who transferred the empire from the proud to the humble. This dual reaction reflects the contradictory nature of Innocent himself, an idealist and a pragmatist simultaneously. Can the Pope be held morally responsible for the tragedy of the Fourth Crusade? Historians still debate this. One thing is clear: the sacking of Constantinople inflicted irreparable damage on relations between the Eastern and Western churches, creating a wound that remains unhealed to this day. The beginning of the 13th century in Europe was marked not only by political intrigues, but also by a deep religious crisis. In the south of France, in sunny Languedoc, the teachings of the Cathars, or Albigensians, as they were often called after the city of Albi, flourished luxuriantly. For Innocent III, this heresy posed no less a threat than political adversaries. The Cathars rejected the main dogmas of the Catholic Church, preaching a dualistic doctrine of the struggle between good and evil principles. They considered the material world to be the creation of the devil, denied the authority of the Church and the necessity of sacraments. Of particular concern was the fact that many representatives of the southern French nobility joined the movement. Initially, Innocent tried to combat heresy by peaceful means. In 1203, he sent legates to Languedoc led by the Spanish bishop Diego of Osma and Dominic Guzman, the future founder of the Dominican order. Their mission was to use words and personal examples of ascetic life to return the misguided to the fold of the Church. However, the preaching had limited success. The situation changed dramatically in 1208, when the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered. Innocent blamed Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who patronized the heretics, for the murder. In March of the same year, the Pope declared a crusade against the Albigensians, the first crusade in history of Christians against Christians. In his bull, he wrote, "Faith must be protected and heresy eradicated. Arise, soldiers of Christ, destroy ungodliness with fire and sword." The northern French barons enthusiastically responded to the call. Many of them saw the campaign not only as a religious duty, but also as an opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of the rich southern lands. Under the leadership of Simon de Montfort, the Crusaders invaded Languedoc. The brutality with which this war was waged shocked even contemporaries. When the Crusaders captured the city of Béziers, one of the knights asked the papal legate Arnaud Amalric how to distinguish heretics from Orthodox Catholics. He allegedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." 20,000 inhabitants were annihilated, the city burned to the ground. This phrase, regardless of whether it was actually uttered, became a symbol of the mercilessness of the Albigensian wars. Innocent himself, it seems, did not foresee such a turn of events. In letters to his legates, he repeatedly called for moderation and justice. However, the political logic of the crusade proved stronger than papal exhortations. By 1213, most of Languedoc had been devastated. Simon de Montfort received the lands of the Count of Toulouse, and local culture and independence were undermined. The Albigensian Crusade posed a difficult moral question for Innocent. Does the defense of faith justify the use of such brutal methods? The Pope himself apparently experienced certain doubts. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, he tried to find a compromise solution to the Toulouse question, but it was already too late to stop the flywheel of violence. The fight against heresies demanded not only military force, but also a systematic approach to identifying and eradicating dissent. It was under Innocent III that the foundations were laid for what later transformed into the infamous Inquisition. The path from preaching to persecution proved shorter than one might have assumed. Initially, the Pope relied on peaceful methods of converting heretics. He sent preachers, called for disputations, and attempted to persuade with words. However, by 1210, it became evident that these measures were insufficient. In a letter to the bishops of southern France, Innocent wrote, "Heresy is like a cancerous tumor. If it is not completely removed, it will spread and destroy the entire body." The first step towards the institutionalization of the fight against heresy was the appointment of special papal legates, endowed with extraordinary powers. Cistercian monk Arnaud Amalric and his colleagues were given the right to remove church hierarchs who were found to be lenient towards heretics. They could also excommunicate secular rulers who did not show due zeal in persecuting dissenters. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, Innocent solidified these changes in canon law. The council adopted the constitution Ad Eliminandum, which obliged bishops to conduct annual investigations in their dioceses to identify heretics. For this purpose, it was prescribed to appoint worthy men who were to report suspicious persons under oath to the church authorities. In fact, this was the first formalization of denunciation as a tool for controlling religious life. The Dominicans played a special role in the new system, an order founded by Dominic Guzman specifically to combat heresy through preaching and education. Innocent himself blessed the creation of this order, seeing in it an effective means against the spread of false doctrines. Later, it was the Dominicans who became the main implementers of inquisitorial procedures. Although the formal papal inquisition was established after Innocent's death, under Gregory IX, it was under Innocent that all the necessary prerequisites for its emergence were created. He laid the legal foundation, developed procedures, and prepared personnel for the future tribunal of faith. The consequences of these innovations proved far-reaching. The institutionalization of the fight against dissent led to the creation of a system of total control over the religious life of Europeans. From now on, not only open confession of heresy, but even the slightest deviation from orthodox views could become a reason for persecution. Paradoxically, Innocent, who sought to purify and strengthen the Church, created a mechanism that, in subsequent centuries, inflicted irreparable moral damage upon it. The beginning of the 13th century was marked not only by political battles and crusades, but also by profound changes in the spiritual life of Europe. Innocent III, for all his political activity, never forgot the Church's main task: the spiritual guidance of the faithful. He understood perfectly well that the renewal of the Church required new forces capable of breathing life into ossified forms of religious practice. In this context, his support for new monastic movements became particularly significant. Unlike traditional orders, which owned vast lands and riches, the new spiritual currents focused on poverty and direct preaching among the common people. In the summer of 1209, a small group of ragged men, led by a young man from Assisi, arrived before the Pope. Francis, the son of a wealthy merchant, had renounced his inheritance and chosen a path of absolute poverty. His simple preaching about returning to an apostolic way of life resonated with many hearts, but aroused suspicion among church authorities. It too closely resembled the teachings of the Waldensian heretics condemned by the Church. The Pope's first meeting with Francis yielded no results. Innocent treated the unusual preacher with caution. However, soon after, according to tradition, The pontiff had a dream in which he saw Francis supporting the falling building of the Lateran Basilica. This dream convinced the Pope of the divine mission of the Assisian preacher. At the next meeting, Innocent verbally approved the way of life of Francis and his followers, though he did not give formal permission for the creation of a new order. This cautious support became a crucial moment in the history of the Franciscan movement. The Pope showed remarkable insight, seeing in the poor preachers not a threat to the ecclesiastical order, but a new force capable of countering heresies. While the Cathars and Waldensians criticized the Church for its wealth and departure from evangelical ideals, the Franciscans demonstrated the possibility of living in poverty while remaining faithful to Catholic doctrine. Innocent also supported another significant movement, the Dominicans. The Spanish priest Dominic Guzman, faced with the spread of Cathar heresy in Languedoc, concluded that successful preaching required educated missionaries who understood theology and could engage in debates. In 1215, shortly before his death, Innocent gave preliminary approval to the new order of preachers. The two new orders, supported by Innocent, later became known as the Mendicant Orders. They fundamentally changed the character of monastic life in Europe. Unlike the Benedictines and Cistercians, who secluded themselves in monasteries away from worldly bustle, the Franciscans and Dominicans directed their activities into the thick of urban life. They preached in market squares, worked with the poor, and established schools and hospitals. Support for these movements shows Innocent in an unexpected light, not as a power-hungry politician, but as a sensitive pastor who understood the need for the spiritual renewal of the Church. November 1215. Rome is overflowing. 412 bishops, 800 abbots and priors, and ambassadors from almost all Christian rulers have gathered in the Eternal City. The Lateran Basilica, mother of all churches, prepares to witness the greatest ecclesiastical assembly of the Middle Ages. The Fourth Lateran Council is the culmination of Innocent III's 18-year pontificate, his finest hour, and the pinnacle of his reformist activity. Innocent had long prepared for this event. As early as April 1213, he sent invitations across the Christian world, declaring the council the General Parliament of Christianity. The agenda was ambitious: church reform, the fight against heresies, a new crusade. The council opened with a solemn mass on November 11th. Innocent, clad in papal regalia, delivered a programmatic sermon based on words from the Gospel of Luke. "With desire have I desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." The Pope applied these words of Christ to himself, as if foreseeing that the council would be the crown of his earthly journey. Over 3 weeks, the council participants adopted 70 canons, covering all aspects of church life. The first canon affirmed the Catholic teaching on the Trinity and the sacraments, particularly emphasizing the dogma of transubstantiation, the transformation of bread and wine into the true body and blood of Christ. This was a direct response to the heresies of the Cathars and Waldensians, who denied the reality of the sacraments. The council paid special attention to ecclesiastical discipline. The canons prescribed regularly holding provincial councils, improving the education of the clergy, and prohibited simony, the selling of church offices. The 21st canon obliged every Christian to confess and receive communion at least once a year, at Easter. This rule, preserved in Catholicism to this day, established a mandatory minimum of religious practice for the laity. The council also made important decisions regarding marriage. It prohibited secret weddings and introduced mandatory announcements of upcoming marriages in parish churches. The degrees of kinship preventing marriage were reduced from 7 to 4, which lessened the number of grounds for dissolving marital unions. In the area of relations with non-Christians, the council showed a duality characteristic of the era. On the one hand, it forbade the forced baptism of Jews. On the other, it introduced for them the mandatory wearing of special clothing to distinguish them from Christians. Innocent personally presided over all sessions, guiding discussions and formulating decisions. Contemporaries noted his tireless energy and attention to detail. In the 3 weeks of the council, he managed to consider many private matters, including a complex dispute over the inheritance of the county of Toulouse. The decisions of the Fourth Lateran Council had an enormous impact on the subsequent development of Catholicism. They systematized canon law, strengthened the power of the papacy, and paved the way for the centralization of church administration. Many historians consider this council the high point of medieval Catholicism, a moment when the Church achieved its greatest unity and influence. For Innocent himself, the council was a triumphant conclusion to his pontificate. A few months later, in July 1216, he died in Perugia, not yet 60 years old. But his legacy, enshrined in the decisions of the Lateran Council, determined the development of Western Christianity for centuries to come. The intellectual legacy of Innocent III remains one of the most significant in the history of medieval papacy. His political activity often overshadows the image of Innocent the Thinker, a man whose theological works and sermons shaped Christian thought for centuries to come. Even before his election as pope, Lotario di Segni had established himself as an outstanding theologian. His treatise On the Contempt of the World, De Contemptu Mundi, became a classic expression of medieval asceticism. In this work, the future pontiff described with striking imagery the insignificance of human existence and the futility of worldly aspirations. Man is conceived in lust, born in pain, lives in toil, and dies in fear, he wrote, painting a picture of the transience of all earthly things. Paradoxically, this text, full of contempt for worldly power, came from the pen of a man who subsequently did everything possible to strengthen the earthly might of the papacy. Having become pope, Innocent did not abandon his literary pursuits. He compiled a collection of sermons that revealed his extraordinary oratorical talent. Particularly noteworthy are his Christmas and Easter sermons, where complex theological concepts are expounded in clear, accessible language. Contemporaries noted Innocent's ability to speak both profoundly and understandably, a rare quality among learned theologians of that time. In his theological works, Innocent paid special attention to the sacraments of the Church. His treatise, quote, "2 contained a detailed explanation of the Eucharist, the central sacrament of the Christian faith. He asserted the real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and wine, which was later enshrined as a dogma at the Fourth Lateran Council." Innocent's views on marriage also profoundly influenced canon law. He regarded marriage as a sacrament based on the free consent of both parties. This principle, revolutionary for its time, significantly improved the position of women by precluding forced marriages. At the Lateran Council under his leadership, canons were adopted prohibiting clandestine marriages and requiring public announcement of upcoming weddings. Innocent's contribution to the development of canon law is immense. His decretals, papal letters with decisions on specific issues, became an important source of ecclesiastical legislation. After his death, these texts were collected and included in official collections of canon law. Many principles formulated by Innocent continue to operate in the Catholic Church to this day. Innocent's intellectual legacy reflects the duality of his nature. His works combine exalted asceticism with a practical approach to earthly matters, deep piety with political pragmatism. This duality makes his figure particularly interesting for historians. Before us is not just a power-hungry politician or a theologian detached from the world, but a complex personality in whom these qualities were paradoxically combined. Behind the majestic image of the Pope, clad in tiara and solemn vestments, lay a living man with his own passions, habits, and weaknesses. What was Innocent III like outside of official ceremonies and diplomatic receptions? Surviving letters and contemporary accounts allow us, at least partially, to lift the veil on the personal life of the powerful pontiff. Innocent came from an aristocratic family, but upon becoming pope, he deliberately simplified his lifestyle. His contemporary Jacques de Vitry noted, "The pope eats from silver dishes, while his servants use golden ones." This was not merely outward modesty. Innocent genuinely strived for moderation in his personal life. At the same time, in official ceremonies, he insisted on pomp and splendor, believing they underscored the grandeur of the papal office. The pontiff's workday began early. Before dawn, he would rise for prayer, then celebrate Mass, and only after that would he attend to state affairs. His industriousness astonished his contemporaries. Pope's secretary Reiner of Pomposa wrote, "The Holy Father dictates letters with such speed that we, the scribes, can barely keep up." Throughout the day, dozens of documents passed through Innocent's chancellery, from theological treatises to political instructions. Despite his immense workload, the Pope found time for intellectual pursuits. He amassed an extensive library and often secluded himself for reading and reflection. He was particularly interested in the works of Augustine and Bernard of Clairvaux. Innocent was not only a consumer, but also a creator of intellectual output. Numerous sermons and theological treatises are attributed to his pen. In his relationships with close associates, Innocent displayed duality. On the one hand, he did not permit overt nepotism, so common among his predecessors and successors. On the other hand, he did not forget his relatives, appointing them to important positions when it was politically justified. His cousin Richard became Count of Sora, and his nephew Stephen became a cardinal. However, the Pope never sacrificed church interests for familial ties. In personal communication, Innocent could be a charming and attentive interlocutor. Chronicler Roger of Wendover describes him as a man, quote, "two at the same time. The pontiff knew how to be tough when he deemed it necessary. He tolerated no objections on matters of principle and could sharply cut off even a high-ranking interlocutor." Innocent's psychological portrait is revealed in his attitude towards his own power. Unlike many rulers, he did not revel in power for power's sake. Power was for him an instrument for reforming the Church and asserting Christian principles in European politics. This did not exclude personal ambition, but gave it a higher meaning. The image of Innocent III in historical memory has undergone a remarkable evolution. Each era saw in him a reflection of its own ideals and fears, creating a portrait corresponding to the spirit of the times. Even the pontiff's contemporaries were divided in their assessments of his activities. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden called him, quote, "zero." At the same time, the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, appalled by the sack of Constantinople, saw in Innocent one. Medieval chroniclers of the Catholic world predominantly depicted Innocent as an ideal pope, a defender of the Church, and a reformer. His biographer, the author of the, quote, created an almost hagiographic image of a wise and holy pontiff. This view dominated historiography until the 16th century. The Reformation radically changed the perception of Innocent's figure. Protestant historians saw in him the embodiment of all the vices of the papacy, ambition, perfidy, cruelty. Martin Luther called him the Antichrist sitting on the throne of Peter. In the works of John Foxe and other Protestant authors, Innocent appeared as the chief architect of the system of papal absolutism, hateful to the Reformers. Catholic historians of the Counter-Reformation, on the contrary, extolled Innocent as a defender of the true faith against heresies. Cardinal Cesare Baronio, in his Ecclesiastical Annals, created the image of an ideal warrior pope battling the enemies of the Church. The Enlightenment brought a new wave of criticism. For Edward Gibbon, Innocent was the epitome of religious fanaticism and intolerance. Voltaire saw in him a symbol of medieval obscurantism, opposing reason and progress. The 19th century, with its historical positivism, attempted to create a more objective portrait. Leopold von Ranke, while acknowledging Innocent's political talents, criticized him for excessive interference in secular affairs. At the same time, Catholic historians, especially during the period of Ultramontanism, once again glorified him as an ideal pontiff. The 20th century brought a more nuanced view. The eminent medievalist Walter Ullmann regarded Innocent as the creator of the theocratic doctrine, which had a profound impact on European political thought. Helmut Rosenwein emphasized his role in the formation of canon law. Modern historiography strives to avoid both vilification and idealization. Historians Brian Tierney and James Powell see Innocent as a complex figure, combining sincere piety with political pragmatism. They acknowledge his contribution to the development of ecclesiastical institutions, but do not turn a blind eye to the controversial aspects of his rule. 18 years of Innocent III's pontificate changed the face of medieval Europe. We have traced his path from a brilliantly educated cardinal to a powerful ruler whose authority stretched from Sicily to Scandinavia. The time has come to answer the main question: who was this man? A reformer or a, quote, zero? The paradox of Innocent is that he was both at the same time. As a reformer, he cleansed the ecclesiastical administration of corruption, supported new spiritual movements, codified canon law, and convened the greatest council of his time. Under his leadership, the Church became more organized, disciplined, and influential. But the same hand that blessed Francis of Assisi signed orders for a crusade against the Albigensians. The same intellect that created profound theological treatises developed ingenious political combinations. Innocent saw no contradiction in this. For him, the spiritual and the temporal were inextricably linked. He sincerely believed that strengthening papal authority served a higher purpose: the salvation of souls. In his worldview, politics was a continuation of pastorship by other means. When he excommunicated kings or placed entire countries under interdict, he acted not out of personal ambition, but out of the conviction that this was the only way to protect Christian values. Today, 8 centuries later, Innocent's legacy remains relevant. His pontificate raises eternal questions about the relationship between religion and power, ideals and practice, ends and means. Can a good end justify questionable methods? Where does the line lie between spiritual authority and political pressure? These questions do not lose their sharpness in the modern world. Perhaps the main lesson of Innocent's pontificate is that even the noblest intentions can lead to ambiguous results. Striving to protect the purity of faith, he laid the foundations of the Inquisition. Wishing to unite the Christian world, he deepened the schism between East and West. By supporting the Crusades, he unwittingly contributed to bloodshed. And yet, it would be unfair to judge Innocent by the standards of our time. In the context of his era, he was an outstanding reformer, genuinely striving for the renewal of the Church and society. His contradictions are the contradictions of the medieval worldview, in which faith and power, idealism and pragmatism were inextricably intertwined.